Hi, I'm Harford County Executive Bob Castley, and you're listening to the Maryland Association of Counties Conduit Street podcast, featuring in-depth interviews and discussions with state and county leaders on the issues that affect us all.
Welcome to the Conduit Street podcast. This is Michael Sanderson, once again, taking the reins and taking the mic. And with me this week is a guest whom I've wanted to have on the podcast for some time. Finally got him to agree. He's my longtime friend and predecessor as director at the Maryland Association of Counties, David Bliden. David, thanks so much for joining.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation, Michael.
So David and I go way back, and I had the pleasure of working with him at MACo for a good long time. But I wanted to spend a little time today. I feel like as the MACo podcast, we have found ourselves in a niche where we talk about a pretty wide range of policy issues and politics stuff. And we've got a sizable number of followers who are sort of into that sort of thing. So a lot of it has been focused on county governments. Sometimes we talk about the MACo conference or the MACo priorities, but a lot of our conversations have kind of just turned into general policy chat. Here, I did want to do a little internal conversation with you, David, because you've got a lot of perspective on how MACo came to be the shop that it is today. You had a big hand in that. I'm really proud of that. I think you ought to be too. And I wanted to chat through a little bit of that with you. So thanks for joining today.
My pleasure, Michael.
So does it make sense to do this kind of sort of TikTok article style, and we kind of go start to finish? Do we dial all the way back to maybe the late 1980s, and local governments were facing sort of a liability crisis? Was that really your first serious immersion into Annapolis policy and politics and legislative process and all that kind of stuff?
That was, Michael. It was kind of a new world for me. Prior to the late 80s, actually, probably specifically 85 or 86, I was the deputy county attorney in Anne Arundel County. In that capacity, my charge often was to represent the county in litigation where money was at stake. It was civil litigation. And these were cases, primarily, tort cases, automobile type accidents or police misconduct. And around that time, you had referred to the liability crisis. There was a liability crisis for local governments. And I'd say local governments because the state government had, sovereign immunity, where there was a firewall protecting them from having to turn over the taxpayers' money to plaintiffs' attorneys and injured parties. But that same protection did not apply to municipalities and counties. And in Maryland, you had a unique situation, and this became the basis for what became the deal, where on one side of the ledger, they had a gambit of actions which under the umbrella of governmental actions. And for those, the county or the municipality, in this case, the various municipalities in Maryland, could not be sued. The individual cop or firefighter could be sued, but the county could not. So the county had an out, and that gave leverage to work a deal out to, pay pennies on the dollar for the liability claim. But on the other side of the ledger, there were a gambit of actions called proprietary. For instance, road maintenance. And in those actions, there was no limit to liability for the local governments in Maryland. And as a practical matter, that meant that they could go bankrupt. If you get a $20, $30 million judgments against a small municipality, they go under.
Right.
So that provides the fulcrum for beginning to work towards a resolution. And I ended up being the chair of a county attorney work group which crafted the legislation that ultimately came the Local Government Tort Claims Act, which did provide meaningful protections for the local governments and counties. And I think the first year we advocated for it was 1986, and it was a very bizarre ending to this, where we the governor's office then, Harry Hughes, became engaged in support of our efforts, and the House Judiciary Committee ultimately had the bill. They doctored it up, so we didn't think it was meaningful. This was an illustration of my ineptness at that time. Got an amendment on the floor to fix it, and something happened which I didn't understand. The chair of the Judiciary Committee had the bill recommitted, which essentially meant the bill was dead.
Right.
But in an odd circumstance, the chair then was a guy named Joe Owens, was famous for not reconsidering anything. But the Municipal Association, who was our partner in this, got on it, and he had a lot of municipalities in his district, and they badgered him. So we actually had a reconsideration. They had offered us a deal. I remember we went down to the cafeteria in the General Assembly building, and we decided not to take the deal, which was a tough decision. We had to make it in about half an hour, but fortunately we came back the next year. There was Schaefer took ownership of it, and we ultimately got the bill passed.
Right. And
that
so
was my introduction to the legislative process.
I do like the embedded story. This is one of those things that old cranks like us tell these stories all the time, that you read in the textbook in your political science class or in your law school class that, you know, policy happens on the floor of these grand deliberative bodies, or maybe it happens at the witness stand with the microphone and the expert panel and so forth. But frequently deals are getting cut at the cafeteria or the cocktail bar, or, you know, just like in line for the macaroni and cheese at the firefighters reception on a Tuesday night early in session. Like, that's where a whole lot of legislating and policy happens, at these incidental places around town. Incidentally, one of the things that we really missed when COVID shut down most of the face-to-face interactions was we realized how important those little incidental interactions are. And, you know, going to a Zoom room to deliver your testimony denies everybody the chance to just meet in the lunchroom or go out in the hallway and shake hands in 5 minutes. Right? It was just so.
Yeah. Yes. Well, that of course is the title for lobbyists, because they hang around in the lobby. And
the lobby.
that I've found over the years, as you did, Michael, if you just have a presence everywhere all the time, you have many, many magic moments where you can actually make your point and maybe make some progress on an issue, policy for which you're advocating.
Yeah. So the Local Government Tort Claims Act and a sister law for the state government ended up being, it's hard for people to recognize that there was a before those laws existed. You ended up with people who had, you know, a accident with a cop car, and you could only sue the individual officer. How do you recover, you know, $300,000 worth of damages from an individual officer? And part of the deal of these tort claims acts was to say, if the officer was performing his or her duty and when then the tort happens, then it becomes the government's job to manage, to absorb that liability on the officer's behalf. And that's a better deal for someone who's been injured and is seeking to recover. The government's got more clarity and more predictability in what those lawsuits could look like and when do they show up and so forth. So that was sort of the grand bargain that all came together back then, as I understand it. Is that about a fair summary?
Yeah, and I think one other thing to keep in mind in the context of the cop being in an accident, the cop in those circumstances would appreciate the Local Government Tort Claims Act, because it required the government to provide a defense and also to pay the judgment up to the limits, and beyond the limits, the cop could not be sued.
Right.
Or a judgment couldn't be executed against the cop.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, you can see how it took some of those ingredients to turn that into a larger political deal. But I think you can see why multiple parties would be at the table saying a deal like this serves a lot of interest at the same time. It needs to be a compromise, and there's some things we won't love and some things we won't love and some things they won't love, but on balance it probably became a better system for people who have been injured or who have been wronged, and in many cases a better deal for the governments who got more predictability out of it. And we're at the table sometimes saying one of the things we get is we get to know relatively rapidly if there's broken equipment at the public park, because you have to file your suit on relatively expeditiously under the Tort Claims Act. We don't necessarily have somebody walking that all that open land and that sort of stuff. So all that stuff still.
You've been able to keep the notice requirement, I presume, too, Michael.
Yeah,
which
generally
is speaking. Pardon me?
Yeah, I mean, this stuff is ripe from time to time. Still, it's not like no political deal ever goes without the occasional revisiting and challenges and let's change this or let's tweak that. But for the most part, I think the whole Annapolis apparatus has bought in that what they've generally done is right. And they tweaked it some for police liability a few years ago. The timetables got changed a couple of years ago with legislation around years old, like child sex crimes, where they didn't like the idea of the general statute of limitations or the timing under the Local Government Tort Claims Act becoming an impediment for someone who's now 25 and wants to file a suit saying, hey, when I was 12, this terrible thing happened and I'm finally ready to talk about it and do something about it. At one point, those people had nowhere to go. Maryland, like a lot of places, changed its laws, and that was a little bit of fit and start with those laws will actually probably be in court soon. So
I can share with you what I would characterize as one of those magic moments of legislative advocacy
I'm into
I had in the context of Local Government Tort Claims Act. I know you'll appreciate it, and I suspect many of your readers will. Some of the names may not be recognizable. One prominent one would. I was friends from my Prince George's County days when I was in the county attorney's office with a person named Susan Russell, a delightful person. And she turned out to be the staff person for the Judicial Proceedings Committee, which was the committee had jurisdiction over the liability issues with which we were concerned. And it was in the evening, and I was there, and I was just chatting with Susan. And I see Mike Miller, that was his first year as Senate president, come into the office. Vernon Boozer, who was a prominent Republican member of the committee and a reasonable guy who they all liked working with.
Yep, very popular.
And President Miller and Senator Boozer walked into Chairman Walter Baker's office and closed the door. Then in about 5 minutes, I have no idea what's going on. President Miller comes out and says, Bliden, would you come in for a few minutes? And I didn't say no, obviously.
Right.
But I said, sure. So I go in there, and the question is, would you please explain this Local Government Tort Claims Act to us? And I went through the whole balancing act and tried to promote the benefits.
Right.
And at the end, they didn't give me a high five, which is what I was looking for. But they said, thank you, and closed the door. And Boozer was in the conference committee, as was Walter, and they ultimately became advocates for our position in the bill, thinking that it was reasonable, which was delightful in some circumstance, because President Miller was typically pretty much, in those days, very amenable to the trial lawyers' issues. And this was a fight between us and trial lawyers who were representing the plaintiffs who were trying to, of course, pick our pocket, in many instances for justification.
Right. So that story may well have started, knowing you, David, that may have started because Susan Russell had a dish of chocolate on her desk, and you're there by making some small talk with a friend. And Susan Russell was a great person as well, but she easily could have just been an opportunity born of completely weird sideways moments. You're chatting with a nice person about something and grabbing a piece of chocolate off the little desk drawer, and next thing you know, you're in the back room get a chance for the 5 minutes with three major players on the central issue of the day. Right, absolute magic moment. They happen.
It really was, but it was all downhill from there, Michael.
All right, so let's walk through that a little bit. So that, like, getting exposed with the Local Government Tort Claims Act and sort of getting a feel for how Annapolis worked. So you were a trial attorney. You were doing defense work, and you had worked in the Prince George's law office and Anne Arundel both. Did I remember that right?
That's correct. Yes.
Right. So you had been that kind of county attorney, but frequently the counties sometimes do lean on their legal staff, especially for complicated things happening in Annapolis. We still do that all the time. We'll have county attorneys into Annapolis to testify on workers' comp subjects or some convoluted, tricky case that's turned into legislation and so forth. So, but you sort of caught the bug, and then. So it wasn't all that long before MACo had the executive director job open up. I guess that was in 90 or 91. Is that when that window opened?
It was 91 when my predecessor, Raquel Sanudo, was picked or offered the job as the county administrator in Howard County.
Mm-hmm.
And she accepted that, and then they initiated a search for her replacement, her successor.
Right. All right. So you end up going through the trials and tribulations of, I'm sure, the intergalactic global search for the best candidate and so forth, and work your way through the leadership of county governments at the time with folks who were big shots in local government back then. You end up getting the role and take the seat at the head of MACo, and that's sort of, you and I crossed paths first back in the 1992 session. That was my first year in town as a young pup staffer in the Ways and Means Committee, which did a sizable amount of harm to local governments in 1992, as I recall. But so we ended up crossing paths then. But talk about, like, what your thinking was for MACo as an organization. You get in there as the director. For the most part, the structure of a lot of nonprofits like these are you have a board of directors who are elected officials, but they've got their plates full. They're not looking to manage day by day and decide, about the new copier contract or any of the, that kind of stuff. So you're gonna manage the shop like a business, but also try and help steer the ship as an effective advocate for the county. So what were your priorities when you got the seat at MACo and started saying, okay, I want things to work like this and I want to do more of that?
Well, my predecessor, Raquel Sanudo, was more on the administrative side of the ledger, and she did a great job in that regard. And her legacy really was the local government insurance trust. And she made a huge commitment to that and was successful.
Mm-hmm.
And the local government insurance trust provides insurance for local governments, both municipalities and counties. And I know, Michael, like I did, you sit on the board there as a permanent member of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was primarily Raquel's focus at that time. And it was a heavy lift. And my role in that was the Local Government Tort Claims Act, which provide a foundation for being able to successfully evaluate risks to the local governments, and based upon that evaluation, you would, the local government insurance trust charge insurance premiums. But that was really Raquel's focus on the administrative side of the ledger. Her background was different than mine. I mean, as you mentioned, I was a trial lawyer and I was an advocate, and I, did jury trials and appellate work. So that was what made me drool. So I was allured to the legislative process. After my experience with the Local Government Tort Claims Act, Jim Lighthizer, who was then the county executive for Anne Arundel County, made me his county lobbyist. So I represented the county before the General Assembly. And that involved me and the other legislative staffers and kept me involved in MACo. I was on the legislative committee at MACo as the Anne Arundel representative.
Got it.
And so I had a great deal of exposure to MACo and a real simpatico with the organization. And that's
Mhm.
when I came on in that capacity. And I did have, some contacts. And I to my great surprise, I had actually engendered some respect among the members, which always shocked me. But and that's ultimately how I got the job. But my focus was more as a legislative advocate, and I became aware of my ineptness as a manager, and it took me time to actually mature in that. And also as a legislative advocate, there's a great difference between being a trial lawyer and a legislative advocate. In trial lawyer work, you never ex parte the judge. It's a very formal process. In legislative advocacy, there are really no rules except you can't bribe people anymore, and so you've got the benefit of being a legislative advocate is ex parte communications. Pulling someone aside and having a private conversation about an issue is the way you make hay. So my focus, the transition I would suggest between me and Raquel was, her focus on the administrative side of the ledger. She was incredibly successful. I was more focused on the advocacy side of the ledger, and hopefully I left some debris behind in that regard.
Well, in my book, you sell yourself short in the ending of that narrative, because my sense is the beginning of what at least Annapolis thinks of as MACo. MACo has always had a big conference, and on the sort of administrative and member services side, it's always been good at tending to the needs of the member counties and getting them together to share best practices and do education for the members and that sort of stuff. We've inhabited that coveted spot in the middle of August in Ocean City for years and years, going back before both of our times. But I think the window of MACo becoming a really serious and effective advocate on behalf of county services really dawned when you took the reins and said it's time for us to double down on that part of the shop. You built out MACo's portfolio and said we need to get stronger and smarter at doing advocacy, and I think that was the beginning of a big part of who we are today. So I know as your successor, I've been fortunate enough to draft off a reputation that I think was one of the things that you wanted for MACo, dating back to the early '90s, which now is like reading, reading about the age of the dinosaurs in political terms, when everybody thinks in 4-year lifespans. Thinking about things from 30 some years ago is just reading ancient history. But I think it's relevant for today because that's our stock and trade is we're credible, we're a respected organization. The legislative staff reaches out directly to MACo for input on fiscal notes on their different bills. We collaborate on surveys and projects together all the time. That we're built into the system, and in some ways we're different from just another advocate or just another lobbyist, because we represent the level of government that's delivering so many services that the state the state mandates the counties deliver has become a really common model. So anyway, I'm happy that we get to stand on that foundation, and in many ways I get to stand on your shoulders in that respect, because I'm happy of where MACo is. You ought to be really happy of the way MACo progressed from those early years when you're figuring it out and trying to make the roadmap to where you managed to hand things off. So,
well, thank you. Can I share 2 vignettes with you in that regard?
Sure, I'm on.
One, while I may have been successful, there was someone before me who was much more successful, and that was Joe Murnane, who was a longtime executive director, highly respected. And he took a leave of absence to run Marvin Mandel's second gubernatorial campaign. And then he came back to MACo. And I remember Marvin Mandel, Governor Mandel, would periodically stop by MACo and just come in and chew the breeze. He was a delightful man. And I asked him, I said, after Joe Murnane managed your campaign and came back to MACo, how did MACo do with you? And he said, oh, very, very well. And you had mentioned our coming together when you were staffing the Ways and Means Committee. I remember a particular vignette there where there was some complicated issue, and insofar as tax issues, I had challenges digesting them back then. And I remember you were walking over the State House from the Legislative Services Building. That's probably, 200 yards?
Right.
250 yards. And at the beginning of the walk, I cornered you and I said, can you explain this to me? And by the time we got to the State House, I actually understood this complicated issue. And in my mind, I said, boy, I want to get that guy at MACo.
I like to tell the story that my first year at MACo was it was a peculiar set of personal and professional circumstances, but it ended up the 1992 session fell apart at the end. It was in the depths of a pretty tough recession at the moment. The state was broke and looking to raise revenues to sort of patch up its own budget, and the plan fell apart on the floor of the Senate with like 7 or 8 days left in session. There were 3 separate bills, and there weren't enough votes for any of the 3 bills. They all died. And then everybody just wrung their hands and said, okay, we're going to go into extended session. We don't have any way to pass the budget. And this other, like the reconciliation bill, I don't think they had a reconciliation bill at the time, but a rider bill that changed some formulas and stuff, including a bunch of local aid, and then a transportation bill that included a gas tax increase. And they didn't have the votes in the Senate to make it work, so everything fell apart. And instead of Monday night, midnight being the end, the legislature was still in session on Tuesday because the budget had not been passed. And it was the whole week of wandering around, and like a special super committee formed, including all these swing voters in the Senate, but President Miller and the speaker at the time, and the whole series, Speaker Mitchell at the time, the whole team was meeting in the State House, like 3 cycles of meetings every day to have these new updates on things. And I was tossed in the middle of it because the Senate plan had fallen apart and the House Ways and Means had a plan for most of these big pieces. So as far as raising taxes, cutting counties, and working with gas taxes, all that stuff was in Ways and Means. And I had just wandered into the job at Ways and Means. They were supposed to have a senior person. He left at Thanksgiving to go to law school, and they plugged me in. It was weird set of circumstances. I had no business being in that room, but ended up, playing a role on that stuff. But my telling of the story is MACo couldn't afford to have me staff Ways and Means for long because all these terrible cuts. They're like, okay, we're gonna steal the guy from the opposing team and get him on our team, and have him bring your playbook. So
he hates us. We got to bring him onto our team.
Yeah.
You just joggled my memory about an issue which arose then. And this was in the context of how big of I'll call it a feces sandwich the county had to eat. And I remember Clay Mitchell came to us and said, here's a deal I will offer. If you agree to take an $88 million hit, I will guarantee that the number will not go a penny above that. And so you were buying security for this. Back then, that was a pretty significant hit. That's when $1 million was $1 million. And so I remember we took it to the committee and legislative committee. They accepted it. Then a bunch of the members went over to the State House, the leaders, to convey the decision. Then somebody made a motion to reconsider, noticing that the votes were no longer there to accept the cut. And luckily, it ultimately didn't proceed. But so we agreed to this $88 million cut. I remember that evening. Again, this is I'm fresh in the job. I'm sitting in the office, crying. Why am I here? They're eviscerating the counties, and I get a phone call and it's President Miller and Chairman Levitan on the phone. And their message to me is, we'll give you a better deal. So I had to tell them, it's a credibility issue now. I said, I can't take the better deal because we've made a commitment. So I'm not taking the better deal. Can't do it. I can't go back to my members and say that. And so I remember I went before the Budget and Tax Committee, and a prominent member then was the Anne Arundel Senator, Jack Cade. And Jack Cade was not a shy fellow. He was a brilliant guy, but he could be somewhat belligerent. And he started slapping me around saying, what did Clay Mitchell do to you? What threats did he make to you? And I'm going, no, nothing. He just told me that we'd get smashed unless we took the deal. So ultimately what happened was the Senate reduced the cut to $50 million. Clay Mitchell accused me of conspiring with the Senate. So I had both Clay Mitchell and Miller and Levitan fuming about me, but they got over it pretty quickly.
That's got to be great stuff in your first window of serious negotiations back and forth. As I recall, that was the shifting of Social Security costs for teachers. Is that right? That was the beginning of what ended up being a wave of incremental cost shifts. When times got tough for the state, they look for what problem can we take off our books and put onto these 24 books down here. We saw more of that to come. Yeah.
We ate that sandwich, and the deal we got for that one was, you take this, but you get to meet with the presiding officers every other week.
Right.
MACo coordinates it. You can have the county executives and the MACo leadership will meet with you every other week, and you can jibber jabber with us, and we'll dismiss you as peasants. I think now it's down twice a year, isn't it, Michael? I forgot how it's.
But we still have honestly, we still have a pretty productive meeting 2 or 3 times a session with
great.
The 2 presiding officers. And sure, there are times where we come in and say, we really, really want this thing. And if that doesn't fit with what they think they can accomplish that year, that ends up being a sort of abrupt conversation. But I have seen multiple times in that room where sort of the candor you can get off camera has a certain effect, right? There's one, the way you have to conduct yourself at the witness stand, these days it's being televised, it's on the internet, it's going to be archived. And that, you have to have a certain degree of formality and temperance and so forth when you speak that way. But I don't know, being able to shoot straight and just say, listen, like, this is going to be a real problem for me back home. If we take this cut, I got nowhere to go but this, and I'll get sunk for that. Like, no one back home is going to understand why we shutting down. Why do the libraries have to close at 5:00 on Friday? They'll be, I'll close ballparks for this, and nobody wants that. This is terrible stuff back home. You can talk a different language, not 1-to-1, but like in a room of 10 people. So I'm sure you've been there for the same. You can be a little flippant and say, we get to parade our people in and make our asks and go home, get our heads patted. But every once in a while, that does catch fire and turns into a thing.
Yeah, and every other week was too much, because you go into these meetings and go, what are we going to talk about? We'll just talk about the same thing we talked about 2 weeks ago. Right. And I think perhaps by having them less frequently, it elevates the importance of the meeting.
Yeah.
And like you, I've seen things happen, and I've had instances where I'll give you one if you want to be humored.
Yeah, I'm in.
This was when then Mayor O'Malley was in these meetings, and I think it was back then, it was President Miller and Speaker Taylor. And then Mayor O'Malley went off on why the state cut the income tax. Remember, they had cut the income tax. I think it might have been last year or 2 years, or right before his second his reelection campaign, because there was a perception that there was a credible Republican running against him, and that was true. It was a close election.
Right.
But so O'Malley is going on and on about how dumb this was, and you can see President Miller, who is a proponent of this, getting redder and redder and redder and redder. And finally, he interrupted Mayor O'Malley, and his line was, and this may require an edit, was, "When you were still shitting green, I was in politics." And to O'Malley's credit, you could see, he had those Irish ears, and you could see his ears turn red. But he didn't say anything, which is a credibility
Right.
to his self-control and his managing the issue in a proper way.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think this might even have been a phrase that I grabbed from you, but there were times that I described the former Senate President Mike Miller when he would come to the MACo conference sometimes and be part of our legislative preview or be part of a session talking about some big political issue or whatnot. And as people were coming into the room, I would sometimes whisper, "This guy is an e-ticket," as in the old days when you'd go to Disney World and you got a packet of tickets, and they were only, if you wanted to ride Space Mountain, the most coveted ride, you had like one e-ticket in your packet and you had to use that one. And I was like, this is the one you've been waiting for. He's always engaging. He makes everything entertaining, and he'll usually have a turn of phrase, sometimes along those lines, sometimes less colorful, but frequently very memorable. So he was a one of one type politician, I think.
Tremendous sense of humor. Right. He really knew how to make you laugh, even if you were the subject of his vitriol.
Yes,
yourself.
It's true. Yes, one of my favorite Mike Miller stories that I can't tell on the podcast involves my name preceded by a 4-letter word, and I tell that story gleefully.
Well, that means you got his attention. That was good.
Exactly,
was good work,
right? Yes, exactly. That was a couple years into my tenure on the job. I'm like, hey, I think I've arrived. I got an FMS there. Yeah. So, so I want to close the loop on go back to our friend Joe Murnane. I tell a story about old Joe, who we still believe is hanging around the MACo office. We're still convinced that in the various catacombs and dungeons on the bottom floor, that the ghost of old Joe is still with us on Conduit Street. When we get guests that come by, we have pictures of the MACo presidents and so forth, and we have a plaque. It's named the Murnane Building. I think that's even outside on the front. So apparently, I've heard this story probably from you in all likelihood, but I've told the story enough times now that I'm convinced it's true, even if I made it up out of whole cloth. But that the building used to be a sporting goods store. We have a photograph around somewhere where our building was an old sporting goods store. And sometime, I guess in the 50s, Joe Murnane went to the board and said, "We need to be in downtown Annapolis to be effective. We need to be closer to the State House. There's this little shop down there, and I can renovate it myself. I'm handy, just buy the materials, and I will, as part of my duties as director of MACo, I will do the rehab of the facility and turn it into a habitable office building instead of a place to go buy a tennis racket." And they said yes, and now we own the place free and clear and so forth. And I make a point to say that's no longer in the job description for executive director at MACo. I'm not doing handyman jobs. I'm not going and sanding or soldering anything. You don't want that.
Well, that was one of the unfortunate legacies I left to you conveniently, was the rehab of the building.
Yeah, we were in the middle of a major internal rehab of that building. Not quite a knockdown and rebuild, but almost everything short. We stripped that building down to the studs and did both floors, massive overdue. And then you're like, I'm getting the hell out of here. So just pretty good timing. And the American and Maryland economy are falling apart. This is in 2008. We got workers running around the MACo office, and like you're filling out your last time card and getting the hell out of Dodge. I get the reins on New Year's Day of 2009, and then 45 minutes later, they take all of our highway user money. I'm going around for my first cycle of meetings with the county leaders, and they're like, "Who the hell is the new guy? What the hell's happening in Annapolis? Everything's falling apart up there."
It's funny you say that. When I would run into President Miller periodically, I would say, "Well, I want to thank you, because now I'm going to start heading to Washington, because I've lost $1 billion for county governments, and that I think that gives me credibility to go to Washington now and become a big shot.
Right. Yeah. You're working in their kind of currency, right? They're the B kind of people. Yeah. Now the state has become B kind of people too. But again,
Yes,
times
yes.
it, right? So I want to make one specific mention for timing reasons. I know you had a chance to work with a lot of different county leaders, and you're good at spinning stories and so forth. One of the people I know that you got close with during his time as a county executive, he was president of MACo, is Dutch Ruppersberger. So he was a state's attorney and prosecutor in Baltimore County, served as the county executive. And during his time as exec, he was really committed to MACo. He was very engaged with the legislative committee and on our board of directors, and was actively interested in becoming the MACo president where he served. But he cast a really big shadow on the organization. I think at least over the span of our times with MACo, I think he'd be a Mount Rushmore type figure for our organization, if I do say so myself. So, as Dutch is looking to wind down his term in Congress and a long career of serving in public service, you have any stories you might want to share with our listeners of Dutch as a MACo leader or as a friend in the trenches or anything like that?
Yes. Dutch was on the hiring committee. Then he was on the MACo board, but then he was a Baltimore County Council person. He rose to be county executive. And Dutch is a uniquely personable individual. He thrives on people, and he's a natural leader. He's willing to take tough positions and advocate for them. And when I came to MACo, one of the things that we would do as the executive director, you'd go to the NACo conference, the National Association of Counties conference. And this may have been my first one. I remember I was in Atlanta. And, I had no idea what was going to go on, but I was saying, Atlanta has a new light rail. And I'm pretty excited. I want to try their light rail. It's like public transportation. That's one of between public transportation and penguins, that's how I get my joy. And so I sitting in the office, I get a call from Dutch. He says, well, I'm going to be in Atlanta. I understand you are too. Let's get together. And my reaction was, damn, I wanted to enjoy myself. Now I'm going to be with this county executive. He's going to have a driver. We're going to be insulated. I'm not going to be able to wander around aimlessly like I wanted to do. So I get to Atlanta. Dutch gives a call. He says, let's go to the ball game. I'm not a big baseball. I was as a child, but I no longer. I said, sure, let's go to the ball game. He goes, do you want to take the light rail? I'm going, wait a minute. This may be my man. So we get on the car, the light rail car, between downtown and the ballpark. By the time we get to the ballpark, Dutch has a kid on his lap. He's like entertaining this whole crowd of people. I mean, it was remarkable. He said, well, I don't have a ticket for you, but I'll talk you in. So he talks me in. We end up at the ball game. And, I have all kinds, I'm sure, learning disabilities where I don't have the patience to sit through much. And I didn't want to sit through the whole game. And fortunately, neither did Dutch. Like around the fourth, fifth inning, he said, let's go. We've seen all we need to see. And he says, let's go have some drinks. I'm going, this is great. And so that was really the beginning of my simpatico with Dutch. And we've remained friends since. And he's a wonderful leader and just really a wonderful person. I mean, he's done a great service to our state and in Congress to our country. But Dutch was a one of a kind.
Yep.
But I would also, under Dutch's umbrella, Dutch had his affinity for people really drove him to not just try to hang around with the big dogs. He really had a simpatico with the little dogs. From the counties that didn't have county executives, may have been smaller, weren't as significant. But in MACo, every county had a single vote. So, but he just enjoyed the little dogs, I think, even more than the big dogs. And one of my favorite little dogs is a guy who was a mentor to me, was a fellow named Henry Parker, who was kind of a rough World War II vet, although he was a cook in World War II. So he knew how to cook massive pots of stew. And he was just a delightful man, but kind of gruff. And I remember, as you do, during the legislative committee meetings, you sit next to the chair of the legislative committee. And during my first year there, it was Henry. And I remember sitting there, and you'd always whisper to the chair. I remember I whispered something to Henry, and he goes, "No." I go, "Geez." And then finally afterwards, he goes, "I didn't mean to set you back, Dave. That's just the way I am." But he was just a wonderful guy, and very credible, insightful. And he was back then he was the chair of the county council in MACo County, and then MACo didn't have a county executive, so he was essentially the big cheese, and he was just a wonderful man.
Right. No, agreed. I was really happy. We've created an award through MACo that is kind of like we've created an award in the name of Marilyn Praisner, a Montgomery County Council member you remember well she served as president, her time as director, but she was like super bright, super committed. We named in her name a sort of career capstone public service award, sort of like a MACo Hall of Fame sort of thing. But I was really glad several years ago we got Henry Parker nominated and won the award, and got him to come to the conference and get up in front of a big crowd of people who didn't know him, but like still a legend, like still whispers around the room, "Oh, that's the guy I was telling you about. He was down here." And so that, I mean, it honestly, I'm sure you got this all the time in your tenure leading MACo, about people say, "Wow, I don't envy your job. You have all these different counties, and they must have all these crazy different interests, and trying to keep them together must be really difficult." And I mean, that is an element of what MACo tries to do, and us as the professionals have a role in doing. It's not as divisive a group as people would think. It's not like when we take votes on bills. You mentioned earlier, MACo has a legislative committee, and we get every county around the room and go bill by bill and take positions on bills. And outsiders probably think that we're voting 16-8 on every single bill, and it's blues over here and it's reds over here, or little counties over here. It's like, actually, like we are 24-0 on the overwhelming share of these issues, because they tend to be principles that are not partisan. There's nothing partisan about patching a pothole. There's nothing partisan about being able to run your park department, right? So, but also people on the outside would overstate, "Oh, you have to do all this machinations and string pulling." The reality is you get to work with a ton of really good-hearted people, and it's like you stayed in that job for a nice long time. You had a 17-year run. Is that about right?
Yeah, close to going on 18 years.
Right. So 17, 18 years running the shop. I'm closing in on the same kind of window. There's a reason why both of us have stuck it out. It's a really rewarding job in a lot of ways, but
yes.
Right at the top of the list is feeling like you're arm in arm with a bunch of people who are in it for the right reason. I mean, that's probably for me the number one thing. We go out and meet with people one-to-one. You get a chance to meet people like Dutch, who are just born politicians and human magnets, and you meet with people like Henry Parker, who serves in his community but has a crusty demeanor, but you crack through it, and he's got the heart of gold. I mean, it takes all those stripes, but I don't know, the number of people I've gotten to know, become friends with, they've counted on me for input or advice on things and so forth. Like that, to me, is worth its weight in gold and then some. I love that part of this job for sure.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's incredibly rewarding. It's an incredibly hard job, because the one thing I don't think people fully appreciate, they view MACo as, in many instances, as a legislative advocacy organization, and they forget what else we do. As soon as session's over, we're in the midst, or you're in the midst, I was in the midst of conference planning. And then we have board of directors meetings, and there's just always constant pressures. But the end result is typically incredibly rewarding. I have a vignette about Marilyn Praisner.
Oh, yeah.
And also just one other thing I wanted to share insofar as the one thing that I would put under the umbrella of some success that I had with the support of the organization. Initially, my relationship with Marilyn was kind of challenging. But as time went on, we became very, very good friends. And Marilyn she's a former CIA person. She was
Right.
very, very bright. And
Mhm.
she knew how to make decisions, and she was a credible advocate. But the one thing I found with her is you could say, Marilyn, let me give you another perspective. And she would sometimes say, you're right. I agree with you. But she died during surgery for a heart issue. And I'm in the office, likely during session. It must have been 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. It was late. And the phone rings. Here's Marilyn getting ready to go to the hospital the next morning, or maybe she might have been there already, talking to me about an issue. And the next morning, she was dead. It was just very chilling. But that's how committed she was to the organization. And she was incredibly well respected in Montgomery County and throughout the state.
Mhm.
And she, back then, having a aggressive, competent woman at the forefront presented its own unique challenges. But she really rose to the occasion.
Mhm.
The other thing that I wanted to just raise is when I first came to MACo, the legislative committee would take positions on every bill. So you'd end up with MACo taking positions on 400, 500 bills. And it was an impossible situation. You couldn't be an effective advocate. So we created a system by which we isolated bills affecting counties which had a reasonable chance of passing. That was a staff decision, and those would be brought before the legislative committee. Now, a person could raise another bill if
Right.
they wanted to for consideration. Of course, we'd always try to fight against that bill being considered just to preserve the credibility of the system. But it ultimately meant that we were taking positions on 80, 90 bills at the most.
Yeah, we might get over 100, but we're nowhere near the historical numbers of hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah.
And it definitely
Yeah.
traces
Yeah.
back to that deliberate decision to narrow down and focus, and sometimes to find places where there are other advocates closer to the center of this issue. And even though counties are, we're employers, or we have buildings just like anybody has a building, but we're not the center of this. Like the Chamber of Commerce does a perfectly effective job representing the interest of employers generally. And so unless this is unique to us, this bill is actually really about firefighters and their specific, they have different timetables and schedules and demands. So this is about firefighters. Okay, that's the workers' comp issue where MACo needs to get engaged. But the general thing about we're going to have a waiting week before you get your benefits, and that affects every employer the same, we sit that out. The chamber takes the lead and we draft behind them. It has made us definitely a more effective organization for having basically, focused on the things where you make the most difference.
Yes. I think that's paid dividends.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And it's one of those things that I see it on the 4-year cycle. I'm sure you did too. That after an election, most of our jurisdictions are on the same election cycle, and we'll have like a third or a half of the room during our legislative committee will be brand new people who have never done this before. I was a used car salesman. Now I'm a county commissioner. Great. What are we doing? Oh, I hate that bill. And then we sort of walk them back and say, let's keep our powder dry. Like we got 11 bills we've already talked about this week that we're going to take positions on. We're going to try and support these 4, and we're going to try and amend these 4, and we're trying to kill these 3. And now, like, to take another 20 bills on top of that with ancillary county issues, you're just going to dilute our messaging on the things that are really in the center of our portfolio. And it's a process for everybody to sort of say, why? Oh, but like, this is the only club I belong to. And you guys are good. You guys are good. You go out there and you kill bills. You fix them. I want that done here. And it's a process for folks to realize, actually, I see why MACo is effective. And it's because you don't chase every ball of yarn in town.
Yeah, and it does create some, as you mentioned, some uncomfortable situations where a delegate or a senator calls you or so, you're taking a position on my bill, and you really don't have chutzpah is saying, well, we just don't think your bill's going to make it.
Right.
Yeah. Your
Right.
bill doesn't
Or
have a chance of passing.
didn't feel like it was any of our business. And they're like, but all the people affected by this bill live in a county. It's like, well, okay. So then by that rationale, we should take a position on 3,400 bills a year because every bill affects people who live in counties. You know. Anyway,
and by the way, we don't think you can ever get a bill passed.
Right. Yeah. We're not gonna have that conversation, right?
Yeah.
So I want to cap off with catching up with where you are. You sit as a member of Maryland's tax court, and I thought I would give you an opportunity. So the people who are like true policy nerds, if they've made it this far in the podcast, and we do have some of those folks, if they've made it this far, they're wondering, okay, I've heard this trivia and marginalia about MACo, that's fine, and some good stories about people I know of. I heard a Dutch story and a Mike Miller story. That's pretty good. So let's give them some little trivia about maybe a corner of Maryland government that I bet even many of our nerds don't know anything about. What the heck is the Maryland Tax Court, and what do you do there?
The Maryland Tax Court is essentially an administrative agent within the executive branch. And the job of the tax court, there are 5 judges on the tax court, is to adjudicate beefs about state taxes and assessments. So a significant part of our caseload comes from the assessment department, the state assessment department. And in that realm, dissatisfied taxpayers, whether it be, the Cordish company with Maryland Live, or some fellow who lives on Kent Island who has a house, and they're arguing that the assessment of that house that went up $10,000 is too much. So you get an interesting mix. We also handle income tax issues that come from the comptroller's office, sales tax. It's primarily our jurisdiction, and there's 5 members. At one time, the tax court sat as a 5-member body, but that no longer is the case. We all sit individually and hear cases individually. And for me, it's a culmination of just a storied career. I had a great career as a lawyer. And I always tell people, I said, when I was a trial lawyer, I spent my time kissing the butts of judges. As a legislative advocate, I spent my time kissing the butts of legislators. Now, as a tax court judge, there are a cadre of people who come in and pretend they like me, and they all laugh at my jokes, which makes me feel good. And it's really it's a part-time job position, and it's very rewarding for me because it keeps my feet in the law. And I don't do policy because I'm making individual decisions, but I do have periodically handle cases that have very significant input. And of course, they go up the food chain. We're tax courts at the bottom of the food chain. From us, you go to the circuit court, to the appellate courts. And we've had one case went to Supreme Court, and I suspect we have another one that'll be going to the Supreme Court. So it's a wonderful gig. I really enjoy it. And I was governor. I've been appointed. I was originally appointed by Governor O'Malley. I was reappointed by Governor Hogan. And then I have recently been reappointed by Governor Moore. So I'm running the ambit of governors, which is great. And if you have a moment, I'll tell you the story of how I got reappointed by Governor Hogan.
Hit it, yeah.
So my wife was the deputy state treasurer. And in that capacity, she staffed the treasurer at the Board of Public Works meeting. And the Board of Public Works is a 3-person body: the governor, the comptroller, and the treasurer. So she got to know Governor Hogan. And when she retired, her last day on the job, the last Board of Public Works meeting, Governor Hogan wasn't there. And she wanted to bid him adieu and tell him that she enjoyed working with him. So she decided to go to the open house at the governor's mansion.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, I'd been requested to be reappointed. And I'd known Governor Hogan from past lives. So she's in line at the open house, of the governor's mansion, the holiday open house. And there's a line of people. The governor knows none of them. He's just, trying to be charming. And then he sees somebody he knows, and it's like a breath of fresh air. So she gets the hug. They chat for a minute. She gives him, she says, I really enjoyed working with you. And as she's leaving, she goes, can I raise something with you? And if it's inappropriate, let me know. She goes, Dave's on the state tax court. And he goes, oh, I didn't know that. Does he enjoy it? Says, yes, he enjoys it. I think he does a good job. He's up for reappointment. And I really don't want him around the house. So would you please reappoint him to the tax court? And within 2 weeks, I was reappointed.
Right. Exactly. I mean, hey, sometimes it's not what you know. Sometimes it's who you know. And she knew how to deliver exactly the right message. You hit the heartstrings. Yes. Go for it. Yeah. I love it. Well, David, thanks very much for spending some time. Spinning a few yarns is exactly what I was looking for, but a little bit of personal touch on MACo as an organization for our listeners. It's a little more fabric. We talk about our legislative process and our conferences and that sort of stuff, but a little bit on our history, I think, is great at a good, calm time of year. So we're celebrating the new year. Us fiscal nerds still have a hangover from the big New Year's party. All that sort of thing is fun this time of year. But hey, I think there's a lot of what's happening at MACo today that I'm happy that we've been able to do during my time as director. But I'm very serious in saying you showed me the way of how this place can work and how MACo can stay together and sort of the right levers to pull to keep things on the right tracks. I'm in your debt a great deal professionally. You were a mentor and a leader for me. So you're a big part of what MACo is today, and a big part of I've gotten to benefit from things that you did and the direction you created in your time. So I'm in your debt. MACo's in your debt, and the people of Maryland are too, because MACo helps everybody, I think.
Well, thank you, Michael. And let me reverse that compliment. As a manager, one of your goals should be succession and legacy. And when I talk to people behind your back, what I say, and I think I may have shared this with you, my greatest success at MACo was you succeeding me, because you have not just continued the traditions, but you took MACo a couple levels above where I have it. For example, this podcast. I mean, at my time, podcast and IT was still very foreign to me. But you have really taken the reins of the organization and brought it to a new level, and I get a great joy in your success.
Well, delighted to hear. We're part of the same fan club here. So great to have you on. Thanks for spending some time with us. Folks, we'll wrap that up for this episode of the Conduit Street Podcast. As always, if you enjoy this episode or our usual fare of Maryland policy and politics, make sure you subscribe, and that way every episode will be sent right to the device of your choice. We'll leave it here for this week, but for David Bliden, I'm Michael Sanderson, and on behalf of our producer, Chantel Malcolm Lim, we are happy to have you with us once again, and we will talk to you soon.